Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Emily Dickinson Homestead Parlor. We're coming to you live, and tonight is the July edition of our Phosphorescence Contemporary Poetry Reading Series. Now in its fourth year, this series is bringing you some of the most exciting contemporary poets we know, who have caught the spark of Emily Dickinson's own phosphorescent light. My name is Brooke Steinhauser. I am program director here at the Emily Dickinson Museum. And before I introduce tonight's poets, I have just a few words of Zoom housekeeping for you. So one, we encourage you to use the chat to express your admiration, appreciation for these wonderful poets, words of encouragement. They won't see your comments right now, but we love to use this as a kind of guest book to share with the poets after they have had their reading tonight. So please chime in, and you could start now if you would like by letting us know where you're listening from this evening. So feel free to hop right in the chat and tell us where you're coming from. And then also tonight's reading, following tonight's reading, we'll have a question and answer conversation. We would love for you to participate in that by entering your questions into the Q&A, which is available in your Zoom toolbar. And you can do that at any point during tonight's reading. So let's see, where are you all coming from? You're coming from Louisiana, Indiana, Tennessee, California, DC, Maryland, Wisconsin, Maine, Florida. This is very exciting. Thank you so much, everyone, for being here tonight. We are glad to be here with you. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce tonight's poets. We will hear first from Rosa Lane, poet and architect. Rosa is author of 4 poetry collections, including Called Back, a theatrical monologue in tribute to Emily Dickinson, Imagined. And that will be coming out in September of this year. Very, very exciting. She has also written Chouteau's Chalk, Tiller North, and Roots and Reckonings, a chapbook that speaks to the generational and native culture of her coastal Maine fishing village. And her work won the 2023 Morton Marcus Memorial Poetry Prize, a Maine Literary Award, and the William Matthews Poetry Prize, among others. In addition to her MFA at Sarah Lawrence, she earned a second master's and PhD in sustainable architecture at UC Berkeley, and she splits her time between her native home in coastal Maine and the San Francisco Bay Area, where she lives with her wife. And please do visit rosalane.com to learn more about her work. And that link will go in the chat. Then we're going to hear from Patrick Donnelly. He's the author of 5 books of poetry, most recently Willow Hammer, and little-known operas, Nocturnes of the Brothel of Ruin, which was a finalist for the Lambda Literary Award, and a former poet laureate of Northampton, Massachusetts, that is. Donnelly's poetry explores topics like same-sex love and desire and the AIDS epidemic with lyric strategies. Donnelly is program director of the Frost Place, Robert Frost's old homestead in Franconia, New Hampshire, now a center for poetry and the arts, as well as director of the Frost Place Poetry Seminar. And his translations with Stephen D. Miller of classical Japanese poetry were awarded the Japan-US Friendship Commission Prize for the translation of Japanese literature by Columbia University. His other awards include a US-Japan Creative Arts Program Award, an Artist Fellowship from the Massachusetts Cultural Council, and an Amy Clampett Residency Award, which we were just discussing. And PatrickDonnellyPoetry.com is where you can learn more about his work. So poets, thank you so much, both of you, for being with us tonight. And Rosa, would you like to share your poems with us?
I would love to.
Right.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Brooke and Anna. It is such a privilege to be reading here at the Dickinson Homestead, the place that I know Emily occupied, and in this very room. And then to be reading here with Patrick, it's such an honor. I've been so looking forward to this, Patrick. And also thank you for all of those of you who have signed in to this reading, and happy birthday, Kaylin. I'll be reading from Called Back, which is soon to be released, as Brooke just shared, from Tupelo Press. The book's title, Called Back, utilizes the last two words that Emily Dickinson wrote. Most agree that Susan Huntington Dickinson was a core love of Emily's. Susan was Emily's sister-in-law, and they met sometime in their late teens. Several of the 250 plus letters that Emily wrote to Susan express a romantic erotic passion that took place during the whole lifetime of hers. Research is bringing in new dimensions of Emily's life to light, dimensions that have been overlooked for upwards of 100 years plus. Dimensions which also, some of which have an LGBTQ plus significance. Called Back gives voice to those dimensions, to a reimagining Emily. Each poem catalyzed by selected epigraphs from Emily's own work. Emily used code names when she wrote about Susan, which included, and Called Back uses, such names as Pearl, Rose, Eden, Eve, Heaven, Cleopatra, Vesuvius, just to name a few. And Emily also used a code name for men, divers, because divers was the preferred or the privileged gender who could dive for the pearl. Emily's code name for Sue. And that was allowed within the mores of the social order that Emily grew up in. A social order not too different from my own. New England is some ways always New England, and the socio-religious context is one that carried with it, at least in my upbringing, certain strictures within which I had to live and be accepted or not accepted. I will be reading poems where I'll read the poem title. Then I will follow the poem title with the selected epigraph. Sometimes there's two epigraphs. And then I'll repeat the poem title again. And I have selected a sequence of poems that tell a story this evening. And I will begin with the first poem entitled The Daguerreotype, Camera Obscura. The Daguerreotype, Camera Obscura. Frozen 90 seconds, I staged the pretended parlor, propped, the book, dead flowers in hand, as if I just returned from Homestead's garden fecund, as if before the vase, I stopped shy of the kitchen, slipped off my head, scarf, slid into the slat back, leaned the table, pinned on an elbow, perhaps to muse the closed book. My guise captured on the 6 plate, fixed, barren, and bootless. That copper substrate silver washed, fuming iodine, father's favor immortalized, airtight, framed, lifeless. God forbid my edges might breathe, darken his mantle with no quick nor rash, nor eyes their hazel, shot by a salesman he paid, miniature seized on a latent leaf. I steered into the box, its black hole brass ringed. He slid me into his eye, held me in a trigger, and when his umbrella pulled its limelight, I left my body in the chair, my elbow still resting on the table. For Eve at the Evergreens. The martyr poets did not tell, but wrought their pang in syllable. Dickinson, number 544. For Eve at the Evergreens. On the brink of spilling everything, times swell and bead. I tap the well's rim, pinch my dip pen's throat, nib scratch manila, iron gall ink, each excess rocker blotted. I bleed another black cloud, backlit by lampant light. My sheet grows an orchard where you graze. I hunt your cloven path by way of lava heat, fevered in that trough between couplets, our breasts peak, ash, choking Vesuvian. Our sapphic love disallowed by blueprint. You dissever, I belly lock and refuse to pass the key to the inevitable buck browsing our hungry fence. At dusk, indelible, I marry my writing table, give it my whole hand. French sardines. Wild nights, were I with thee, wild nights should be our luxury. Dickinson, number 249. French sardines. French sardines arrive from Boston, tin-plated. Maggie levers her can cutter at the edge, jacks her hand around the lid of hunger's fulcrum. Silver-skinned and nested, their caudal fins swim a sea of marinade, white salt cured, drenched in extra virgin, beheaded and gutted by the women of Nantes. We lay each body across a soda cracker I have for days dreamed of, craving nights behind each pearly eye. We swim up the fishware. We spawn in sandy silt along the odic thighs of the Loire. We flutter our little deaths. Dear Sir, letter number 4. Society for me, my misery, since gift of thee. Dickinson, 1534. Dear Sir, vortex of heart, or lone star fixed, barred coupling, I dissent, burn a scream, my love of her, doomed, sapphic, disobedient, damned shut. Othered, I speak. Her breast is fit for pearls, but I was not a diver. Her brow is fit for thrones, but I have not a crest. Dickinson, 84. Othered, I speak. I am wrong to start with, to have, to strop and hone the blade, shave without a tuft. To bind, bone wrap my breasts, they will not leave. To swag my trousers and waistcoat in a dark no one sees. To ramrod the barrel, gun cock, lean a corner, the house dead ends. To hike sails, captain my ship, doldrum, drifting nowhere, windless. To bypass the lungs, drop my voice to the diaphragm, timbre, gravitas. To smoke my meerschaum, virile and fragrant, blending Latakia, smoke rings in solo. I kerf the flesh of Adam's apple, pith the larynx, my mouth plosive, hushed. Hair decor. Amputate my freckled bosom. Make me bearded like a man. Dickinson, 1737. Hair decor. Hair decor. A pair of bodies hangs from my chest, sistered and whaleboned in a cuff. I want nothing of them. Still tethered and corseted, these oddments, small thimbles, two berries made for the mouth, speak a primal language, not mine. A wolf's ravish, or the infant's pucker for milk, a utensil gorged and sucked. Those fleshy hills are there for swallowing, wan, two drifts of snow, wind-blown, renounced, raised by slice or tear. My bust blanked, like paired Caesaras, phantom nipples hover, endless pause. My hairless chin, densed and wild, my mouth squared. I am my beard, edged along the jaw, tinted curls, free fall, re-pronoun, plumed and proud. Hiding April. A pang is more conspicuous in spring, in contrast with the things that sing, not birds entirely, but minds, minute effulgencies and winds. Dickinson, 1530. Kiting April. Find me in white, billowing south wind, flat chest shaped by darts. Inside my pocket, a poem folded on the back of an envelope teases my pencil. I push the breast plow, garden thawed third week, crocuses already blooming centuries ahead. I till and turn the bed, soak my seasonal brain like seed, mud-kneed. I edge and furrow, winter forgiven. I reach for the jar, pour the whole garden into my apron draped bowl. And where frost left its wound, I drop a seed into the O of Pock, a soft vowel planted between consonants. Beware of the clicking jaws of the aphid mind. and how the emerald march of these tiny dots can skeeve a whole plot. And when sheaths crack open their specters, shoot up esophagy, unfurl their mouths for cupping copper blue, the poem will unfold its envelope, release every pinion, slant upward, full timbre, skir the empyrean. Limning death. I felt a funeral in my brain. Dickinson, 280. She dealt her pretty words like blades. Dickinson, 479. Limning death. Immortalities strut around this homestead as if they own everything. Their ceremonials stop at the mantle forevering. Farthest daguerreotypes seal our faces, brass matted, muted, red velvet softens a haze of black bleeding in. My little room, more shadow than light, spins on the wheel of death. I am an impalement artist, one knife toss away from the thrower's mistake. I disappear in tiny mouthfuls each day. I study any sign of being taken, my room stunned by mourning. I am still here. Yesterday, I died again, swept myself into a dustpan, rattled the windows like a beggar's cup. I yearn for the perennial garden, yet I have no gender, just the moon waxing her wont at the bluff. Transistus, when the blue moon, when the blue mist rises. You cannot fold a flood and put it in a drawer. Dickinson, 530. Transistus, when the blue mist rises. I hover. Only my body inhabits space. A deserted village you trespass. You bathe my streets. Snuff gas lamps yellowing the common. You close my lids, clip cowlicks, understories, overgrowing the banks of Fort River. I lean into the field's narrow neck. You unwrap the bandage, kiss the wound. Rosed by yet another May, I smell coming. You turn your back as if you could ignore the river ascending its limbic rim, rushing past my bureau, my bed, already carried down rapids, our secret purpling hyacinths in a vase of regret. I descend the stairs in a box balanced on the shoulders of 6 Irishmen. Vinnie's violets dress my throat, the back door open to my garden. I lie in the parlor, 2 heliotropes in hand, bloodstones, earthy green, flexed with jasper. Its bright red reminder before redemption, before dynastic close. Wounds lay bare in even fall's last light. Dear Sir, letter number 6. After Emily Dickinson's after 100 years. 1147. Since then, 2 centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Dickinson, 712. Dear sir, my bones lay in a bed of dust, jangle the Stygian box, the depressed whirl of earth at the soft pock behind my headstone. My breasts disappear in cones of dreck I sweep. My beard still thickens. My hair, a river of red, extends my waist. I swim the meadow, collect stars in a basket. I see light echo shade where my horses whisper and blink a universe I live. My sparrows wing ahead with no care for the blues left in their tailwinds. I strum my ribs full octave like a barbiton lyre. For the Dionysians, I chant canticles. My lungs breathe, pink as tulips. I sail the Ionian Sea, drift the lilacs. My arms unspool rings of the tallest pine. My hooves trot the dark, canter puffer's edge. I listen for syllables, pause every dash. Oh, sir, if you could have had me outlive a century, I would have known you as tutelary wave, your holograms radiating my blooms, patterns of you cohering fragrance in wavy light, the homestead and the evergreens crisscrossing serpentine paths, never the same trajectory or loop, that strange attractor I now know as good. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Rosa. That was so great to listen to. Hi, everybody. I'm Patrick Donnelly. I feel so grateful that my life has brought me to this room tonight. To me, this house is one of the temples of the human spirit where a great artist lived and worked. And I'm really grateful to Brooke and Anna and everybody who works here for keeping the flame lit and for interpreting this place and Dickinson's work for visitors around the world. To state the obvious, Dickinson was a master of the very short poem. That highly pressurized lyric that casts off a resonance far bigger than its little footprint. And as is my most important teacher, the poet Martha Rhodes. So pretty early on, I tried to see what I might achieve in these small spaces. And as it happens, I'm going to lead a class on this subject on September 29th for the Tell It Slant Poetry Festival 2024, and registration will be available later this summer. So I thought I might read a group of my own short or very short poems about sonnet length or thereabouts. With my husband, Stephen D. Miller, I also translate classical Japanese poetry. This was a whole culture with mastery over short forms for about a millennium and a half. So I'm going to throw in a few of those translations as well. I chose standalone poems that don't depend for context on being in a sequence, and that left out some of my shortest poems, but that's okay. I forget who said that reading a bunch of haiku at the same time is like being nibbled to death by goldfish. Hopefully you will not feel that about my poems. It might help that, you know, the stakes are pretty high. Sex, death, arguments with God, not unlike the person who lived in this house. So here are a few short poems from my first book, A Charge. Prayer after the baths. Thank you for causing no man to love me for more than a few minutes at a time with such art as Big Tall Tom has used this night. Because when he took off his baseball cap to rub his buzz cut along my belly, murmuring under his breath a baritonal sweet, I was in danger of becoming one of those who have their reward in this life. And then the proud palm-shaded pew you in your famous jealousy have prepared for me among the ranks of minor martyrs might have gone unoccupied. Young man reading Colette on the train. You hold my gaze a little too long, your hair cut short like a boy's, your fine little glasses, at your ear glint of gold, in your cheek a slight shade of wasting. This is to say, I see you, I know you. I am alert to your potential, to ours, on this train, on every train, on the platform, on the stairs to the street, on the dim threshold, in the elevator stopped between floors, in its flickering lights. Then in that dark opening, if we are spared, where I may find my way to you, graceful ghost of a chance. Angel's trumpet. In order to tell him he would die, a few weeks shy of 28, I needed only to place 2 vials of brown glass on the bedside table in front of his tissues and tulips. Which are they? He asked. Angelica, I said first, reading from the book, Angelica Archangelica, protection of the angelic realm. Then the other, almost casually, Datura Candida, angel's trumpet, and did not read, for when the soul must utterly surrender. It was not my place, was it, to put the cold embouchure to my lips and blow? Cool. The fat man with purple sores all over his legs is looking at me, and I am elaborately not looking at him as we wait for children to clear the pool and laps to begin. Shall I call the lifeguard? I'm afraid of the fat man with his almost open sores. I don't tell her, and I don't ask what it will mean to climb into the pool with him, because no one can say. And when I lay my body into the slow lane alongside his, where he can't keep from brushing, from touching me as we roll to breathe, at the end of every lap, he is waiting, he is watching, he is looking at me. Prayer after refusing to pray. Why, when the ferocious beauty that steers this world has never braked for any cry of mine, do I find myself making again toward you who will always do just as you please, these motions with my lips and hands and knees, trying to gentle your vast wheel off the rails. My friend is sick in the lymph behind his heart. A monk, a teacher, your servant who loved you so. The title of the next poem is in Latin, supposedly Jesus's last words, meaning it is finished. Consummatum est. With the certainty theologians claim for the salvation worked by Christ, effects not yet seen, but the end not in doubt, some women look back and know the exact moment they conceived. He brought me home from the baths and fed me takeout Chinese. I remember succulent little bits of egg in rice, creamy sherbet right out of the carton. Yes, certainly I felt it and broke into a sweat the exact moment the charge leapt from him to me. Was it 2 years later his best friend called? Could I use his clothes, his shoes, his king-size bed? I am sleeping where you died. The days are short, the trees bare again like then. The scar of your departure down the narrow stair still arcs the wall. Oh, my little friend, thank you for the hollow you left in this pillow. I practice putting my bones here. Instant coffee. When every winged thing was falling for sweetness in my cup, in the last dregs of light at the end of a sunset dock, I gave up and poured it in the lake and watched that cloud of cream expand and hold an instant in the dark water before summer knelt into the cold, dispersing her bright crystals. Every night. 1 second before I click off the light beside the bed, I shut my eyes to pretend I choose in which dark I'll sleep. The next poems are from a book called Nocturnes of the Brothel of Ruin, where I mix my own poems with Japanese translations. From the Japanese of former Major Counselor Kinto, The Gate to Everywhere. The world is saved because no one can shut the gate to everywhere. Oh, who will not enter? Before the fall, I flew and tore my pants at the knee, but before that trip, I was happy, thought the way was clear. Later, I washed my little wound at a sink, paid for needle and thread at the newsstand with a hand that shook. The shock, not from bleeding, but from being caught not knowing I'd have to kneel on stones in front of strangers. Here's another subway poem. There's no better place for projecting desire onto absolute strangers. All in black, my love went stretching up to the grip strap, tensing, releasing perfume like a cathedral. Imagined love only in those days, whose mouth hung sullen and whose wrists perfect. He refused to look at me, cracking the spine of his book. You might know that Gluck's opera about Orpheus couldn't bear to end the story with Eurydice yanked back to Hades. In Gluck's happy ending, the gods relent, the lovers reunite. Cue the key of D major, the ballet of shepherds and shepherdesses, the tender crowns of daylilies, for those who can't bear the pure Greek truth. No kind of singing can bring back the dead. This poem has an epigraph from one of Dickinson's letters to her cousins, Frances and Louisa. It's called Paradise on Black Ice. Heaven hunts round for those that find itself below, and then it snatches. I wind this sheet of elegy while he's still alive. I can't help it. I follow his breath while he sleeps, greet each coming and going with an Ave, because of how the quick become the dead. But right now, he's showering with a gospel choir, radio half on and half off that station. And today's heaven is half hell, half whole, half hurt, hunting every naked thing with the same harsh delight. The middle section of this book is a group of elegies for my complicated, troubled mother. And it begins with maybe the most beautiful and mysterious of all the Japanese poems that Stephen and I have translated. From the Japanese of Gyoki. The debt I owe the breasts my mother in tender mercy gave, to 100 stones add 80, I repay today. Cradle song. When I signed for her ashes, I received her as once she received me into her lyric hold and let me ride anchor there, smaller than the letter Aleph. They gave her into my hands, 7 pounds, 2 ounces, as once they had given me into her hands. I set her on the hearth shrine, as she set me once a place at her table among her other needy charities. After 9 months, I scattered her back to that cold Delphine Atlantic of hers, to tidal squalls that rip and sigh their salt across the rocks, as once she let me fall, unready, onto this world's gasping, shouting, love-stained shore. The mother's ashes reply. When that man put my ashes in the water, for the space of 4 green waves I held together as a knot of milk, then a 5th thing of water broke open my last seals and delivered me to be nobody and nobody's mama. Moving now to a couple of poems from my book, Little Known Operas. Modes of transmission. Airborne, his breath, his glance, his handwriting, his nickname for you and others of his secret accounts, tears, his tears, also causing yours, the wearing of his ring, sharing food from his plate, thin wafer of cacao, beloved of God, from his hand, taking his hand, his hat, his headscarf, full of his scent, and, O Christ, from his lips, his spittle, parable, his plain song. The moon. We coupled like rabbits, me with hundreds, hundreds with me, hundreds with hundreds, in those orgies on narrow beds at the baths. Some nights their faces from the 80s rise. Ken Ketwig, Stephen Simmons, Ramon Castaneda, Doyle Hardin, Michael Donatelli, Robbie Middle, Peter Von Lame, Christopher Morrissey, Terry Cook. Did you know there's a rabbit, not a man, in the moon, battering with his pestle, pounding the new rice in his mortar, crushing, releasing the elixir of life? And I'm going to finish with one poem from my forthcoming book, Willowhammer. The poem ends with a passage from the Roman poet Horace. Spell check corrects HIV to BIP, which is a little bit funny and even possible if each of the dead were welcomed, crowned, compensated? Or does it mean there's a place where AIDS never happened, where hawk never caught the dove, or the swift hunter the hare in fields of snow? Thank you so much for listening.
Wow. I wish all of you were here in this room to offer your applause to these poets. So thank you for letting me offer another round of applause on behalf of all of you. Thank you so much. Not only are your poems extraordinary, but your delivery is so beautiful, both of you. It's almost like you've been doing this for a little while. Which I say sort of jokingly, but actually that kind of is my next question. You both have several books under your belts. And so could you tell us about the process of creating those books? How do you share your time with the muse, to use a phrase that Rosa, you used on our first conversation? And has that process changed for you as you've come into your own?
Well, my first book, a full-length book, Tillard North, really is a memoir of a lobster fisherman's daughter. And my second book, Shuto's Chalk, is a memoir of a queer daughter of a lobsterman. And so I went with more and more coming out and giving language to that whole process of finding myself queer in a New England small village, and then finding that boldness, that agency, and an identity that I became more and more expressive in the poetry itself. So what was a memoir, getting into the descriptions and the experiences of growing up in a small lobster fishing village, and then to growing up queer in that same village, and the difficulty and the struggle, the challenges of that, which isn't unlike, Emily Dickinson in terms of that socio-religious Calvinistic, strictures. And then, so as I was growing in myself, as a queer person, as a queer New Englander, as a queer Mainer, as a queer daughter of a lobsterman, so did the books grow to this point where I could, I hope, be able to, and call back to align and to bond and to really discover Emily, not the icon, the person under the icon or other than the icon, but that person who also grew up in a similar, context, I guess. And so that is, I hope in the next book, which is already in the formative stages, the working title is Syzygy, which has to do with the universe and heavenly bodies and the forces between them. But I'm leaving New England and heading out to the universe. So I see it as kind of a progression, an opening in terms of how these books unfolded one into the other, almost like the last poem of one book led into the first poem of the next book.
My process isn't very arcane. I don't think, I grew up with a highly literate parents, and I wrote since I was a kid, and I tried a bunch of different professions before I came back to writing, and I studied with some great teachers, and I try to work hard because time feels short, and I realize it's a privilege to be able to work, but I try to keep working, no matter what is going on in life. I turn back to that to try to make sense of my life and try to take the sting out of some experiences and to explore them. And my teachers were all about service to other writers and other artists, and they modeled that for me, and I try to do that too. I mean, the writing world is hard. It's a tough life, and I try to make it easier for some people to come up behind me in whatever ways I can.
You're both, I think, pretty interested in form in your poetry. Today we heard a lot of wonderful short poems, as you said, in homage to our Emily Dickinson here. We heard persona poems
Yes.
from you.
Yes.
What does form mean to you in your work? Why is it important? How does it inspire you?
I have worked and received forms, some that wasn't my temperament or gift. I've had to work pretty hard to give it to myself. But I think just speech is a form. I mean, life is a form. Everything living takes a form that is organic and that speaks to what the thing is. So I try to work without knowing, rather than saying I will now write XYZ, because that doesn't usually work. So, exploring like, what does this want to be? And sometimes it's not clear for a long time, but it's exciting when it starts to show itself.
I can speak to that a little bit. In architecture, the whole question is which comes first, the form or the function? And so in a similar question, in terms of poetry making, it totally comes down for me to cadence and the spoken word. So I'll be working. I mean, there'll be a something that will show itself, a word that I'll wake up with, which is what I've been doing, a poem a day this whole month of July. So I wake up with a word and I just sit with that word and just let it find its psychic space. And all the while I'm just writing, maybe nonsensical writing, whatever. And then at some point, that's handwriting. And it's similar with architecture. I cannot design on the computer screen using CAD. I have to be designing with a pencil, and similarly with poetry, starting out with the pen. It's alive, and it's an interesting moment because it does feel like it's a zone of being in that's other than life as usual. And it's like getting into that zone, it's the poem begins to form itself. It's an astounding experience, and I always feel lucky to have it. And I'm always searching for it, and it's painful not to have it. But when you have it, it is absolutely purely magical, and it's hard to describe, but it's something finding its form, and then it just at one point just clicks, and then the words will find where they're supposed to be on the page, and then the laptop comes in handy at this point. So I can, just work with it, but always with that cadence in mind, with the musicality of it. If it doesn't work musically, it's not in that psychic space. And it's similar with architecture. It's in architecture, we would call this a partie, which carries, it's an initial little tiny, maybe a little thumbnail sketch that carries the whole design in it. And it's just a matter of unpacking that and getting to know it, because the whole building will come out of that tiny little seed. And it's very similar for me in poetry making.
I love what you said about the spoken word is sort of always in your thoughts.
Yes.
Are there moments in your process where you are in fact speaking your words out loud?
Oh, yes,
Yes,
I
yeah.
have to. I apologize to my spouse in terms of, and I write very early in the morning before the first bird song. That's the moment, So I have the whole house to myself. I have my sunroom where I sit, my special place, and I think, well, I hope Catherine doesn't come down now because I am now singing. And then the words will find, and I will literally remove a word if it really clunks, and it will clunk. I mean, you can just feel it. So,
I want to add something in the hopes that it might help somebody, which is that I feel a lot of self-doubt, and it's completely bound up with my work in the sense that I never know what I'm doing or if it will be any good. So for anybody that feels that it's okay, you have to clear a space, to kind of get that demon off your shoulder a little bit to work or to play. But I don't think it's important to feel enormous self-confidence or, this is going straight to the Paris Review. It's like, no, nothing might happen to it. So the whole process has to be for me to sort of surmount my doubts, even to just get it on the page. So that goes out to anybody who does feel that, on your end, you can still do this and you can still work.
What a courageous act that is. That self-doubt, you are program director for the Robert Frost Place in Franconia, New Hampshire. Rosa, you have just produced this wonderful volume of work in the voice of Emily Dickinson. You are clearly both working sort of in the shadow of these tremendous poets of the past. How do you do that? What does that mean to you as a poet to do that?
Do you want to tackle that?
I will try to. I had to, well, the only thing I'll start with this. Catherine would make a cup of tea and bring it to me, and she would say, "Now, what century are we in?" And it would, of course, be the 19th century. So in immersing myself into as much as one can, you know, from a contemporary modern place as we are in our 21st century, to then break that barrier of time and place, I began studying everything about this house, about Amherst, when the first railroad happened, how roads were made, what a typical bedroom, how functional it was, what was used, the infrastructures of the house, what kind of oil went in the oil lamp, you know, what businesses were going on, what noises were heard from whatever perspective. And in doing that, it almost became like a habitation of living in another century. I mean, it's so steeped that I feel as though that writing that came out of that, in terms of the next work I'm working on, I have to shed that. I have to, and I have still in the 19th century, and in terms of letting that, I had to be there, inhabiting it, in order to really get a sense, as much as one could, because one can't do it purely, of course. But it was definitely a sense of inhabiting 19th century. And then out of that, finding voice, finding that cadence of a 19th century. But it took really understanding the context and the place and the dwellings, and imagining the activities that would go on in this house from morning to night, and then throughout the night into the next morning, and just immersing myself in it like I was inhabiting a bedroom here.
Right down to the aphids on the roses in the garden.
Yes,
I love your aphids.
I'm not sure that answered the question, but I'm going to hand it off to Patrick, and maybe we can chime in later.
I don't see myself as contending with these people who made enormous achievements in what Rosa and I are trying to do, but in my own way, with the tools that I know how to use, with the materials that have come up for me, I can work and I can play, and without comparisons. You know, sometimes you catch the tailwind of a great writer, and you might try to imitate something that they did, and that can be wonderful. But without comparing, I just try to go to my tools, you know, on a regular basis, like a potter goes to the clay, and just see what can I make today, and what will happen, and try to surprise myself, you know, above all, you know, try not to be boring. Billy Wilder said his mantra was "Don't bore." And, you know, I'm always looking for a new way in with the material, because, oh, I know so-and-so treated this topic this way. Let me see if I can find a new way in. So, no, I don't get up in the morning trying to do battle with Robert Frost. I don't think that would, for me at least, that would not result in a good working practice, but just get up and work the clay, see what happens.
But being so close to Frost's lived place,
Yeah,
you know, we just heard from you, Rosa, your process was to so fully immerse yourself in this place with Emily Dickinson. So much of your programming is about access to Frost's place and legacy, even if remotely, virtually. So there is something about place, isn't there? That's
there is, but there's also a lesson in Frost's life because he moved a lot. He was all over the place, and he followed work, you know, and he kept working wherever he was. So I think that's the model, you know. It's great to visit the house in Franconia or any of the places he lived and worked, and to look at his chair and his little writing desk that he'd sat on his lap and all that, just the way it is. There's a charge that comes in being in this space, but that'll only carry you so far. If you really want to work this art, you have to find the way for yourself. And he wrote some of the greatest poems in the English language, you know, and I turned to them just the way I turned to Dickinson or any other great poet, including the poets who are writing today. That I think we're in a huge era for poetry right now, that there's no need to be nostalgic about the past. That there are marvelous poets writing today. So
yes, so true. And
dot,
that's,
dot, dot.
that's why we're so pleased to have, you know, this contemporary poetry reading series, because we totally agree with that. So, and you said you do turn to poets of the past, as well as poets of the contemporary moment. Your poetry tonight brought so much reflection on queer life and joy and loss and lived experience. So I'd love to hear a little more from you both about what Emily Dickinson's queerness or queer adjacency means to you as poets.
It's huge for me, you know, a little gay boy from New Mexico in the 60s to be in this house tonight is huge. And to me, she's a model for many things, but one is nonconformity, that she took her own path, and that meant a lot of different things. That she took her path in her writing, in her life, in where she lived, and how she lived, in the relationships she built, in the clothes she wore. She struck her own path. And you know, when you're being assaulted by the majority and the opinions of the majority as a queer person, it can be crushing. And so this house is a temple of the human spirit in that way too, that she made her way against some steep odds to be who she was. And that's huge, to be able to seize on for anyone who's not the majority, who's different and in a way.
I had an experience where I really had an eye-opening to Emily's queerness. I had the I guess the traditional view, if you will, that we're all taught in school, that she was a recluse, pining away her years in a corner bedroom because of some failed heterosexual love. And that is what I had until Ellen Louise Hart and Martha Nell Smith's Open Me Carefully, Emily's passionate letters to Susan, arrived on our dining room table somehow. We're still trying to figure out how. And I went, open me carefully. I opened the book carefully and I read the introduction and I was totally blown away. We're talking about 2019 in the spring. And my world was turned upside down regarding Emily Dickinson. And then I read in Hart and Smith's introduction about the romantic and erotic expressions of the sum of the 250 some odd letters that Emily wrote to Susan. And I'm going, what? And I just put everything down and I just read cover to cover that entire book. And one thing that is said in the introduction is, let this work speak for itself. You look at it. Well, I rolled up my sleeves, I got my lens out and I did a deep dive into Emily Dickinson's 149 poems, 1,789 poems and the 10,049 letters. That's Johnson. I need to update with
The Miller,
with
yeah.
Miller's and Mitchell's work. And I reread over and over again, because this was during the pandemic now. So I was in solitude in our house in Maine. And I just read over and over again and again. I began to tabulate these queer indicators where I found gender fluidity and queerness in Emily's poems. And then in her letters that are primary sources, I found this level of just homoeroticism that just leapt out of so many of the letters she wrote to Susan. And I'm going, what happened over the 100 plus, or maybe even 38 years it's been now, but over the 100 plus years, how did this get overlooked? How, because the Dickinson that is the recluse pining away in a corner bedroom is still being taught. And so that really, what emerged for me in terms of your last question as well, is I never thought the poems in Callback would see the light of day. This is my private, personal odyssey with Emily Dickinson. It wasn't planned for a book, but that's where it landed. And the poems began to emerge as I was making notes. I began to take notes in first person, which was really odd. I usually don't write persona poems, but this is a book of persona poems in the imagined Emily. And so finding her queerness was a discovery for me. And then to see it just so blatantly there. And that couplet, which is, that's the couplet, the 2 lines epigraph to my poem Père de Corps. Amputate my freckled bosom, make me bearded like a man. That knocked my socks off, because it's imperative demands ending with an exclamation point. They're finished sentences in the first quatrain of that particular poem, 1737. And it just, but when I got there, I went, oh my gosh, this is someone who, spoken code, a lot of, and then got to that and just exploded. The I speaker, her supposed person that she wrote to Higgins about, exploded. So that's where I became, and just following her and documenting her own work. It was like something bubbling up underwater, but bubbling to the surface. So for me, it was a whole process of discovery. And I spent 3 years delving into this, again, with no thought that I would take those journal entries and that they would become poems. They did that later.
So much discovery for you in this process.
It was,
Yeah.
I didn't grow up with that, you know, and it was just totally just like a dark room where someone puts the light on in 2019 in spring.
And
So-
we were all still discovering Emily Dickinson, and we will never stop discovering Emily Dickinson. I
Absolutely.
love hearing about your experience with that.
Yeah, what a complex, multi-dimensional person, and this is one dimension of a mysterious, ever dynamic and I consider that mystery sacred to keep.
Yeah.
You know. But there's also a voice there.
That's why she can be a hero to a lot of different kinds of
Yeah.
people and a model for a lot of different kinds of writers. Because she had different modes as a writer. She could lean into the wit, into tragedy, into anguish, into nature. You know, her tones were various. And so I think many different kinds of writer can take her as a model. And like, just to touch on one thing, the narrative opacity in some of the poems, my life had stood a loaded gun. You know, we don't know what that meant in her autobiography, but it could mean a million different really useful metaphors for her and for us. You know, what is it like to be dependent for one's identity and life on someone else? And that was just one poem. So I think queer, not queer, all kinds of people she can be a hero for many different kinds of people, for knowing herself and making the creation of her life, not just her work.
And I mean, maybe for her self-doubt too, right? To touch on your earlier comments, I think one need only look at Emily Dickinson's work to understand that self-doubt probably has a really important role to play in all creative endeavors.
Well, and certainly that mode is in the poem where she's just crushed to earth at some points and expresses that, you know, just barely able to breathe or to go on. I mean, and we can turn to those poems, and I have when I feel like that, you know, de profundis clamavit, and it's like she or any other poet who expressed those things can be near a person when they feel those things.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Rosa. I'm going to turn in a minute to see if we have some good questions coming in from the crowd, and I'll probably only have time to take one of them. So I'm going to check this while you had add your final comment on this question.
Yes, I was in listening to you, Patrick. I was remembering a letter that Emily wrote just weeks before she died to Susan. And it said, do you remember what whispered to Horatio? And as you know, Shakespeare was very important to both of them as they played roles, you know, in the Antony and Cleopatra trope for one. But I looked up what she might have been talking about. And just paraphrasing, so Shakespeare, forgive me, what she was asking Susan to do and to remember is to report me and my cause rightly, tell my story. What is her story? I mean, that in terms of what did Susan know? I mean, unfortunately, I'm not sure Susan got a chance, given the complexity of the circumstances after Emily passed away. But what is that story that she wanted Susan to tell? And it was to tell, I think, if it's what Hamlet told Horatio from his deathbed, to the unsatisfied. That's what the Shakespeare quote says. And so it's like, what is the story? She wanted it to be told, and she wanted Susan to tell it because Susan knew it.
Yeah.
So, I mean, that relationship is just so profound. I'm just at awe at that, the love that they shared, and Emily's passionate expression of it. Yeah.
Thank you so much. This has been such a fun and really interesting conversation for me to engage in with you. I want to make sure we get at least one question in from our audience at home. I think I'm going to go with this one since we just have time for the one. Thank you to all of you who have submitted questions. This comes from Susan. She's asking you to reflect back a little bit on your career. What do you wish you might have done differently in your life as it relates to writing your poetry?
I honestly can say nothing. I wasn't in control of any of it. Like everyone, I just stumbled my way forward, and I wouldn't go back a single day or hour.
We're reporting your story rightly to the unsatisfied. It was what it was, yeah.
Yeah. Well, it's, I was reminded of hearing, which I was lucky to have done, to hear May Sarton at Colby. Maybe you were there.
No.
Where she was asked this question, and I think her answer, which I'm not sure is mine, but she said that prose, she could leave. That, I mean, she could, if she never wrote prose again, it would be fine with her. But poetry, if that was taken away, she would die. And so I did have a point where after getting the MFA from Sarah Lawrence, where I really questioned whether I was a poet or could express myself. I think what had happened is that in my own maturity as a person, or lack thereof, at that point I was in my early 30s, that I ran out of things to say. I ran out of literally maturity of handling topics, a subject matter that could ever lend a poetic voice to. And I had to live life a little more in order to be able to mature myself into a place where I could develop and discover myself as a poet or in poetry. So I had a 23 hiatus in architecture where I never wrote, I wrote one poem in 23 years. When I handed in my dissertation that fall, I took a beginning writing class in Berkeley at the Berkeley Community College and started all over again. I wrote my very first humble little poem, I guess if you could call it that. And those poems from that point on, this was in 2006. So I went from 1983, I graduated with my MFA with just wonderful teachers, Jean Valentine, Jane Cooper, Tom Lux, Grace Paley. And in 1983, I just hit a wall. I communicated with Jane Cooper about this existential moment in my life. And I I devoted myself, I applied to architecture school, I gotta do my second love, I guess. And so I lost connection with poetry for some reason, I lost it. And then I wrote one poem during that whole 23-year period, and in 2006, that fall, I handed in my dissertation, August. That same, within the week, I signed up for a beginning poetry class, and again, started all over again, and then began a process of discovering myself as a poet. Now, I would, similar to May Sarton, I would die without it.
Thank you.
I mean, the great thing about writing, and this is probably true of other arts too, is that no previous experience is wasted, including the failures. So it's all material
Yeah.
to take up and try to work in a variety of ways. So
Thank you both. Thank you so much for this conversation. Thank you for your beautiful readings tonight. It's been such a joy to talk with you and to hear your poems. And thank you to all of you who have joined us from at home. You have been listening to Rosa Lane and Patrick Donnelly, and we hope that you will go online to learn more about their work and buy their books. And you'll be seeing some links in the chat, which we'll put in now. And while you're headed online, you could also go to emilydickinsonmuseum.org. There you can learn more about the Tell It Slant Poetry Festival. If you can't get enough of Patrick Donnelly tonight, you can be signing up. Signups will open next week for his workshop on the short poem. So we all want to learn to write short poems like Patrick Donnelly. If you also visit emilydickinsonmuseum.org, you will be able to learn more about the remainder of this year's 2024 Phosphorescence Poetry Series. Next month, we are featuring Omatara James, Willie Lee Kinnard III, and Joshua Jennifer Espinoza. And we will be streaming these events live on Thursdays monthly now through October. And so we hope that we'll see you again. If you'd like to make a donation to the museum, we really appreciate it. It helps to support free programs like this, and we couldn't do it without you. Thank you so much, everyone, and we wish you well. Have a good night. Thank you, Polly.